"There's nothing more we can do, Walter. You need to let her go." The vet said it, standing in the doorway of the stall, his voice low, his eyes not quite meeting Walter Hayes's own. Behind him in the straw, Sugar lay on her side, her chest rising and falling too fast, her right foreleg twisted at an angle no leg was ever meant to bend. The bone had come through the skin. Blood had dried black in her white sock, and in the vet's hand, capped and ready, was the syringe that would end it. Walter didn't move from where he knelt beside her head. He was 71 years old, a man who had spent 38 years with a scalpel in his hand, who had opened more chests than he could count, who had held more lives together with his own 2 fingers than any man had a right to. He looked up at the vet, and he said the 4 words that would change everything that came after. "Get out of my barn." The vet blinked. "Walter, she's suffering. The compound fracture alone. I know what a compound fracture is, son. I was setting bones before your father was born." Walter's voice cracked, not from anger but from something older and rawer. He looked back down at Sugar, at the way her dark eye rolled toward him, wet and frightened and still, somehow, trusting. "I'm not putting her down today, not tomorrow. Get your truck off my property." What Walter Hayes did not tell the vet that morning, what he could barely admit to himself, was that he wasn't just fighting for a horse, he was fighting for the only sound he'd heard his grandson make in 3 years. And he was about to spend 8 months of his life in a stall, sleeping on straw, to find out if a broken mare and a broken boy could heal each other. Before this story goes any further, ask yourself something honest. Is there an animal in your life right now, or one you've lost, that you would have knelt beside in that straw and said the exact same thing, that you would have fought the whole world for, even when the world told you it was already over? Walter would have told you, before that spring, that he didn't believe in miracles anymore. He'd buried too many patients to believe in anything but odds and outcomes. He'd buried his wife, Eleanor, 6 years earlier, cancer that took her slow and then all at once. And 2 years after that, he'd buried his daughter, Anne, in a car wreck on a wet county road outside of Bozeman, Montana, on a Tuesday evening in October that Walter still could not speak about without his hands starting to shake. Anne had left behind a boy, Eli, 7 years old at the time, sitting in the back seat of that car, buckled in, alive, physically untouched, and utterly silent from the moment the paramedics pulled him out. He had not said a single word since. Not to his grandfather, who took him in without a second thought. Not to the string of doctors and therapists who came and went over 3 years, each one gentler than the last, each one just as unable to reach him. Not to anyone. Walter had retired from surgery not long after Eleanor passed, tired in a way that had nothing to do with his hands, which were still steady as stone. He'd moved out to the ranch he and Eleanor had bought decades before as a dream for their old age, 40 acres outside of Livingston with a barn, a pond, and enough sky to make a man feel both small and free. He had never expected to be raising a silent 7-year-old alone in that house, watching the boy eat breakfast without a word, walk to the bus without a word, come home without a word, and go to bed without a word, night after night after night after night for 3 long years. Walter had been a cardiac surgeon for most of his working life, a man who had trained himself, over decades, to hold panic at arm's length while his hands did what needed doing. He had told families terrible news in cold hospital hallways more times than he could remember, had learned the particular art of staying steady while someone else's whole world came apart in front of him. None of that training had prepared him for the different, quieter kind of helplessness that came with watching his own grandson disappear a little more each day, in a way no scalpel could reach and no diagnosis could name. He had tried everything a grieving grandfather could think to try. He had taken Eli fishing at the pond behind the house, sat beside him for hours without either of them speaking, hoping the quiet might feel like company instead of loneliness. He had bought the boy books, model kits, a bicycle. Eli rode alone down the gravel road every afternoon, never once inviting his grandfather along. He had sat outside therapists' offices in town more Saturdays than he could count, watching Eli walk in silent and walk out just as silent an hour later, and had driven home each time with his jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached, furious at a world that could take a boy's mother and his voice in the very same instant. The house had a particular kind of quiet to it. Not peaceful, heavy. Walter used to be a man who talked to fill silence, the way surgeons do in an operating room, calm chatter to keep a team steady. Now he found himself talking to nobody, narrating his own days out loud just to hear a human voice in the kitchen, while Eli sat across from him, blonde hair too long, eyes down at his cereal bowl, present but somehow gone. The only place Eli ever seemed to come alive, even a little, was the fence line by the barn, where a copper-colored quarter-horse mare named Sugar grazed every morning. Sugar had come to the ranch 9 years earlier, a green 4-year-old off a ranch near Miles City, bought half for Eleanor and half because Walter, even as a busy surgeon, had grown up on horses in eastern Montana and never quite lost the itch. Eleanor had loved that mare with an uncomplicated, total love, had brushed her every evening after work, had taught her to come at a whistle, had ridden her along the ridge behind the house until the cancer took the strength from her legs. When Eleanor got too sick to ride, Sugar would still walk to the fence every time Eleanor came outside, and lower her big head over the rail so Eleanor could press her forehead against it, and the two of them would just stand there, woman and mare, not moving, for as long as Eleanor had strength to stand. After Eleanor died, Sugar became Walter's. He fed her, groomed her, talked to her the way he'd once talked to Eleanor across the kitchen table. And when Eli came to live with him 2 years later, silent and shattered, it was Sugar who noticed the boy first. Eli would not go near the house's other animals. He flinched from the barking of the neighbor's dog. He ignored the barn cats entirely. But something about Sugar, her size maybe, the sheer unbothered calm of her, the way she never asked him for a single word, drew the boy to the fence rail every single day after school, rain or shine, snow up to his boots in January. He would stand there for an hour sometimes, saying nothing, and Sugar would stand on the other side of the rail with her ears turned toward him, matching his stillness with her own, the two of them keeping each other silent company in a way that Walter, for all his medical degrees, could not explain and did not try to. Walter watched this from the porch some evenings, coffee going cold in his hands, and felt something in his chest that was almost hope. He never pushed Eli to talk. He'd learned, through 3 years and a dozen well-meaning specialists, that pushing only made the boy retreat further, curl tighter around whatever he was carrying. So Walter did the only thing he knew how to do. He made sure Sugar was always there. He kept her exercised, kept her feet trimmed, kept her healthy, and let the fence line be the one place in the boy's whole small world where something soft still happened. It was March, mud season, the kind of Montana spring where the frost comes out of the ground and everything turns to soup, when the bond between the boy and the mare deepened into something Walter would later understand was the whole hinge of everything that followed. Eli started climbing the fence. Not over it. He never crossed onto Sugar's side, but up onto the second rail, so he was eye level with her, and he would sit there after school with his arms folded on the top rail and his chin resting on his arms, watching her graze for as long as the light held. Some days Walter would bring out an apple, quartered, and set it on the rail without a word, and some days the apple would be gone by morning, and Walter never knew for certain, never asked, because asking felt like it might break something, whether it was Eli who fed it to her, or Sugar who simply took it herself. Then, one gray afternoon in late March, Walter came around the corner of the barn to bring in the water buckets and stopped cold in the mud. Eli was standing at the rail with his hand out, flat, the way you're supposed to offer a horse a treat, and Sugar had her muzzle resting soft in his open palm, breathing slow, warm breaths onto his fingers, and Eli's shoulders were shaking. Not with sobs exactly, with something quieter. Walter stood frozen behind the barn corner, not wanting to be seen, watching his grandson cry silent tears into the fur of a horse's nose for the first time since the accident, and Walter had to press the back of his own hand against his mouth to keep from making a sound. That was the moment Walter understood, with the same certainty he'd once felt cutting into a patient and knowing exactly where the problem was, that Sugar was not just a horse anymore. She was the thread. Whatever was going to bring his grandson back to language, back to life, was going to run through that mare, and Walter would have done anything at all, to protect that thread from breaking. Which was exactly why, 6 weeks later, standing in that stall with the vet's syringe raised and Sugar's leg shattered in 3 places, Walter Hayes said no. The accident happened on a Tuesday, which Walter would later think was a cruelty all its own, because Anne had died on a Tuesday too. A late April storm rolled through in the night, thunder cracking hard enough to rattle the barn's tin roof, and Sugar, usually the calmest animal on the property, spooked badly in her stall. Nobody ever knew exactly what set her off. A branch coming down near the barn, maybe, or lightning striking too close. But by the time Walter got out there in his robe and boots, flashlight shaking in his hand, Sugar had gone through the stall's wooden partition trying to escape whatever terror she thought was coming for her, and her leg had caught wrong in the splintered wood as she fell. The sound she made, Walter would say later, was the worst sound he had heard in his entire life, and he had heard men scream on operating tables. He called the emergency vet line with hands that hadn't shaken like that since his surgical residency 30 years before. He knelt in the straw and blood and rain-soaked mud, talking to Sugar low and steady the way he used to talk to patients coming out of anesthesia, telling her she was fine, even as his surgeon's eye, the eye he could never fully turn off, took in the angle of that leg and understood exactly how bad it was. Eli came out to the barn in his pajamas at some point during that endless hour of waiting, drawn by the noise or some instinct Walter didn't understand, and he stood in the doorway of the stall with his bare feet in the mud, staring at Sugar down in the straw, and for the first time in 3 years, Walter heard a sound come out of his grandson that was... Walter had no time that night to think about what that sound meant. He only had time to hold his grandson back from the stall with one arm, while he held Sugar's head steady with the other, waiting for headlights on the driveway. The vet who came that night, a young one, competent, kind but young, took one look at the leg in the beam of his truck's headlights and gave Walter the number nobody wants to hear. Less than a 5% chance of a horse that size and that age ever standing sound again on a fracture like that, and a considerably higher chance that she'd suffer through surgery and recovery only to be put down anyway. He recommended euthanasia that very night, out of mercy, before the pain got any worse. Walter refused. He asked for pain management, splinting, and time. The vet, uneasy but respectful of a man who was clearly not going to be argued out of anything, obliged and left before dawn with a warning that Walter should call the moment. The moment. Sugar seemed to be suffering beyond what any animal should bear. For the next several days, that warning hung over the barn like weather. Walter barely slept. He set up a cot in the aisle outside Sugar's stall, checked her vitals every 2 hours through the night, the way he used to check post-op patients, and during the day fielded calls from a rotating cast of vets, ranch neighbors, and well-meaning friends who all said some version of the same thing. "It's time, Walter. You know it's time. You, of all people, know when a body can't be saved." That was the thing nobody understood. Walter did know bodies. 38 years of knowing bodies. And something in him, some stubborn certainty he could not fully explain to the neighbors standing in his driveway shaking their heads, told him that this leg, This specific, terrible break was not, in fact, unsalvageable. It was catastrophic. It was the kind of injury that ended horses' lives every single day, all across the country, for good and sound reasons. But Walter had spent nearly 4 decades putting broken things back together with wire, plates, patience, and time, and something in him refused to accept that the only difference between a horse and a human, when it came to a shattered leg, was whether or not somebody was willing to try. His son-in-law's mother called that first week, gently, to say that maybe it would help Eli to see that some things simply couldn't be fixed, that this might even be a lesson in acceptance the boy needed after everything he'd lost. Walter listened to the whole thing on the phone, standing in his own kitchen, and then he said, quiet and final, "My grandson has had 3 years of watching things he loves disappear. He is not getting another one. Not while I've still got 2 working hands." He hung up the phone and went back out to the barn, and that was the night Walter Hayes, retired surgeon, decided he was going to build his grandson's horse a sling. The lowest point came about 10 days in, when infection set into the wound where the bone had broken skin, and Sugar's fever spiked high enough that Walter sat up with her through an entire night, convinced, for the first time since he'd refused the vet, that he'd made the wrong call. She lay flat in the straw, barely lifting her head, her breathing shallow, and Walter pressed cold cloths to her neck and administered the antibiotics with hands that had gone cold themselves, and somewhere around 3 in the morning he put his forehead down against her warm neck and said, out loud to an animal who could not answer him, "I don't know if I did this for you or for him. I think maybe I did it for both of us, and maybe that wasn't fair to you." He thought about Eleanor that night more than he had in months. He thought about the 2 of them at this same fence line, years back, and about how Eleanor used to say that the ranch had taught her more about dying well than any hospital ever could, because animals didn't waste time being afraid of what was coming. They simply lived, fully, for as long as living was possible. Walter did not know, kneeling in that straw at 3 in the morning with a fever spiking in the only creature that had reached his grandson in 3 years, whether he had the right to ask Sugar to keep living simply because 2 broken humans needed her to. He thought, too, about the operating rooms he'd spent his whole career inside of, about the exact moment in every surgery when the outcome tips one way or the other, and there is nothing left to do but wait and watch the monitors. He had always hated that moment, the powerlessness of it, the way all his training came down to holding still and trusting a body to do what a body was built to do. Kneeling there in the straw with Sugar's fever raging, Walter realized he hadn't escaped that moment by retiring. He had only traded the operating room for a barn, and the monitors for the rise and fall of a mare's ribs in the lantern light, and he found, to his own quiet surprise, that he still did not know how to simply wait without also praying, even after decades of telling himself he didn't believe in anything beyond what a chart could show him. By morning the fever had not broken, and Walter, for the first time, allowed himself to imagine actually losing her, and what that would cost, the boy sleeping fitfully in the house, and he did not know if he could survive delivering Eli a second unspeakable loss. The fever broke 2 days later, on its own, or from the antibiotics, or, Walter would say later, only half joking, because Sugar had simply decided she wasn't finished yet. And that was when the real work began. What followed was 8 months that Walter would later describe, to the very few people he ever told the full story to, as the hardest and most sacred stretch of his entire life, harder even than his surgical residency, harder than losing Eleanor, because this time there was no team, no hospital, no protocol. There was only him, a rigged-up sling built from harness leather and boat straps hung from the barn rafters to take weight off the healing leg, a splint he redesigned 4 separate times using diagrams he sketched himself late at night at the kitchen table, and a stall he mucked and disinfected twice daily with the same discipline he'd once brought to a sterile operating room. He slept on that cot in the barn aisle for the better part of 6 months. He learned to read Sugar's discomfort in the flick of her ear and the set of her eye, the way he'd once read a patient's chart, adjusting her pain medication, her positioning in the sling, the pressure of the splint, one small correction at a time. He called in an equine vet, a different one, older, more willing to work alongside a stubborn old surgeon than fight him, twice a week for imaging and consultation. And between those visits, Walter did the daily, unglamorous, unrelenting work himself. The wound cleaning, the range of motion exercises he invented from what he remembered of physical therapy protocol. There were setbacks that would have broken most men. In July, the splint shifted overnight and the leg swelled dangerously, and Walter spent 11 straight hours rebuilding the support from scratch, while Sugar stood shaking in the sling, and he talked to her the entire time, low and constant, the way he used to talk in the OR, narrating every step so she'd have something steady to hold onto besides pain. In September, she developed a pressure sore from the sling itself, and Walter had to redesign the padding twice more, cutting up an old horse blanket and Eleanor's spare quilted saddle pads, sewing new supports by hand at midnight with fingers gone stiff from age and exhaustion. He kept a notebook on the workbench in the barn, the kind of thing he used to keep on hospital rounds, and every night before he let himself sleep, he wrote down the day's numbers, temperature, appetite, the color of the healing tissue, the degree the leg could bear weight, small measured facts that gave his exhaustion somewhere useful to go. He read veterinary journals he ordered by mail, called old surgeon friends across the state at odd hours to talk through swelling patterns and bone alignment, treating Sugar's case with the same rigor he'd once given a human patient on his table, because some stubborn part of him refused to believe an animal deserved less care than a person simply for being born on 4 legs instead of 2. Money grew tight that year in ways Walter never mentioned to anyone but the bank. Feed, medication, the vet's twice-weekly visits, the equipment he had to buy or improvise. None of it was cheap, and his retirement had not been built to carry a horse's recovery this long or this hard. He sold Eleanor's old truck that fall, the one she'd driven to town every Saturday for groceries, because he needed the money more than he needed the memory sitting idle in the garage, and he told himself, loading the last of his savings into Sugar's care, that Eleanor would have sold it herself twice over for this. Through all of it, Eli was there. Not talking, still not talking, not once, in all those months, but there, every single day after school, sitting on an overturned bucket just outside the stall, watching his grandfather work. Some days he handed Walter things when Walter's hands were full, a roll of gauze, a bucket, a pair of scissors, and Walter learned never to say thank you too loudly, never to make a thing of it, because the boy handing him gauze without being asked was itself a kind of language, the first real communication Eli had offered anyone in 3 years, and Walter didn't want to scare it away with too much attention. Walter's own body paid a price that 8 months. He was 71, then 72, sleeping on a cot in an unheated barn aisle through a Montana autumn and into the edge of winter, and his knees ached in a way they hadn't since before his last surgery ever, and his hands, steady as they'd always been, began some nights to tremble faintly from cold and fatigue in a way that frightened him more than he let on to anyone. A neighbor, seeing the exhaustion in his face at the feed store one morning, asked him outright if it was really worth it, all this, for a horse. And Walter, normally the gentlest man in any room, nearly took the man's head off before catching himself and simply walking away without. By November, Sugar could bear weight on the leg for short periods outside the sling, wobbling but upright, and Walter began the slow work of rebuilding muscle that 8 months of stall rest had wasted away, hand-walking her in tiny circles around the barn aisle, 5 minutes at a time, twice a day, watching her favor the leg less with each passing week. It was excruciatingly slow. Some days felt like no progress at all. Some nights Walter lay on his cot listening to Sugar shift her weight in the dark and honestly wondered, if he was only prolonging suffering for an animal who would never truly be sound again, if his stubbornness had cost her comfort she deserved and never gotten her, or him, anything real in return. It was during the worst of that doubt, in early December, with snow finally down on the ground and the ranch gone white and silent, that the vet, the older one who'd come to respect Walter's work more than he ever expected to, stood in the barn aisle after an exam and told him something that changed the whole shape of what Walter believed was possible. The bone had healed. Not perfectly. There would always be a slight thickening at the fracture site, a small permanent reminder of that April night. But it had healed solid and clean, and the vet said, in the plain, unemotional language vets use because they've learned not to promise more than medicine can deliver, that he thought, with continued careful work, Sugar had a real chance to walk sound again. Maybe even, eventually, to be ridden light if Walter was patient enough to let the muscle rebuild at its own pace. Walter sat down hard on a hay bale after the vet left and put his face in his hands, and for the first time in 8 months he let himself cry the way he hadn't let himself cry since Eleanor's funeral, deep, silent, shaking sobs of relief that had nowhere else to go. The breakthrough, when it finally came on an ordinary Tuesday in early January, 8 months almost to the day since that storm had shattered everything. Walter had brought Sugar out of the barn for her daily hand walk, moving her slow and careful across the packed snow in the small paddock beside the barn, and something in her simply changed. He would never be able to explain it any more precisely than that. One moment she was moving the careful, hesitant way she'd moved every day for weeks, favoring the leg, testing each step. The next moment, Walter swore later he felt it before he saw it, some shift in the rope in his hand, some new confidence in the pull of her lead. Sugar lifted her head, flagged her tail the way she used to as a young mare, and broke into an unmistakable, joyful, if slightly lopsided trot across the snow, circling the small paddock once, twice, 3 times, before coming to a stop in front of Walter, blowing hard, ears pricked forward, eyes bright in a way Walter hadn't seen. Walter stood frozen in the snow with the lead rope slack in his hand, watching the mare he'd nearly lost move under her own power, sound, alive, whole in a way that felt like it defied every statistic that young vet had recited that first terrible night. And it was in that exact moment, with tears freezing on his face in the January cold, that Walter heard the sound that would undo him completely. Eli had come out to the porch, drawn by some instinct or by the sound of hooves on packed snow, and he stood there in his coat, unmoving, watching Sugar trot the paddock, and then, clear, high, cracked from 3 years of disuse, but absolutely, unmistakably real, Eli's voice rang out across the yard. Sugar, one word. Her name, called out loud across the snow in a voice Walter had not heard his grandson use in 3 years, since the night a wet county road had taken his mother and his words along with her. Sugar's head came up at the sound of her name, ears swiveling toward the porch, and she left off her trotting and walked. Sound, solid, real, straight toward the boy at the rail, and Eli scrambled down off the porch steps in his socks, not even stopping for boots, and ran through the snow to meet her at the fence, calling her name again and again, laughing or crying or both, his voice breaking over the syllables like a boy relearning how his own mouth worked. Walter stood alone in the middle of that paddock and watched his grandson speak for the first time in 3 years to a horse that 8 months earlier had been given up for dead by every professional. He would say later that he and Sugar looked at each other in that moment, just for a second, over the top of the boy's blonde head, mare and man, both of them healed in ways the other could never have managed alone, and that it felt, for one impossible heartbeat, like the two of them had planned it together all along. What came after that January afternoon unfolded slower than the miracle itself, the way real recoveries always do. Eli did not suddenly become a chatterbox. He said Sugar's name that first day, and little else, and it took another 2 weeks before he spoke a full sentence to his grandfather at the dinner table. "Can Sugar have an apple tonight?" 6 words that made Walter set down his fork and turn his face toward the window so the boy wouldn't see him fall apart. But the dam had broken, and slowly, unevenly, the way ice goes out on a river in spring, words kept coming. A therapist who'd worked with Eli for 2 of those 3 silent years told Walter, when he called to share the news, that this kind of breakthrough wasn't uncommon after prolonged selective mutism following trauma. That sometimes the nervous system simply needs one thing. It trusts completely, one relationship with absolutely no danger in it, in order to risk language again. And that, in her professional opinion, Sugar's survival, and everything Eli had witnessed his Walter thought about that explanation often in the months that followed, turning it over the way he used to turn over a difficult diagnosis, testing it against everything he'd watched happen in that barn. He decided, in the end, that the therapist was probably right, and that it didn't matter to him one bit, whether you called it psychology or faith or simple stubborn love, because the result was the same, sitting across from him at the breakfast table every morning, talking now about school and about horses and eventually, about his mother, in small, careful pieces when he was ready. Neighbors who had shaken their heads in the driveway that first terrible week started stopping by that spring for entirely different reasons, wanting to see for themselves the mare everyone had written off, and wanting, more than that, to hear the boy talk. Eli would show them the small scar along Sugar's leg, where the bone had once broken through, tracing it with one finger, explaining in his own careful words how his grandfather had built the sling, how he'd redesigned the splint, how long it had all taken. Details he'd apparently absorbed in silence over 8 months of watching, stored up. By spring, 1 full year after the accident, Sugar was carrying light weight again. First, just a saddle pad and Walter's hand on her back. Then, eventually, Eli himself, 7 years older than he'd been the last time he sat a horse. But finally, gloriously, willing to try. Walter led them both around the same paddock where Sugar had taken her first sound trot, watching his grandson sit tall and unafraid on the back of the mare who had refused, alongside him, to give up. And he thought about Eleanor, and about how she used to say that this ranch had taught her everything about dying well by teaching her, first, everything about loving. Walter Hayes sold nothing, changed nothing, moved nowhere. He is still on that same 40 acres outside Livingston today, an old surgeon with knees that ache worse every winter, and hands that still, when he needs them to, go perfectly steady. Sugar still meets him at the fence every morning, favoring that leg just slightly when the weather turns cold, a small, permanent signature of the night she nearly died. And Eli talks now, all the time, the way boys are supposed to, about school and friends, and, more than anything, about the horse he still calls, every single day without fail, by her name, the very first word he gave back to the world. Walter tells people now, when they ask him why he did it, why a 71-year-old retired surgeon spent 8 months of his life sleeping in a barn to save one broken mare when every expert in the county told him not to bother, that he didn't actually know, that first night, kneeling in the mud with the vet's syringe raised, that he was fighting for anything more than one horse's life. He just knew he wasn't ready to let one more thing this family loved slip away without a fight. He learned only afterward, the way you learn most of life's real lessons, backward, from the ending, that sometimes the thing you're desperately trying to save is also, quietly, without you ever noticing, the thing that ends up saving you. If you've made it this far, sit with this for a second. Is there someone in your life right now, a grandchild, a neighbor's kid, someone you love who's gone quiet in a way that scares you? And is there an animal right now standing in your own yard or your own memory that you know in your bones could be the thread that brings them back, if only you're patient enough to hold on and not let go? Tell us in the comments, what's the name of the animal that has healed someone you love or healed you? And if you were in Walter's place that first night, kneeling in that stall with the vet telling you it was time to let go, would you have said the same 4 words he did? If you love stories like this one, stories about the bond between people and the animals who save them right back, hit that subscribe button, because every single week we bring you a brand new story just like Walter and Sugar's. One more true reminder that love, patience, and a little bit of faith can still work miracles. Like this video, drop your answer in the comments, and subscribe so you never miss the next one. We'll see you in the next story.